recording our class on this computer. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. So tonight, I'd like to welcome you to take this moment and welcome you to lesson 4 of Journey of the Soul, which is entitled Where We Go, a discussion about where the journey takes us. Before we actually talk about where the journey takes us, I want to preface that I was actually quite enthused when preparing this class, as I find it significantly different than any of the classes that we have taught in this course to this point. I would expect that a number of you signed up for this course because the topics of death and bereavement and grief is something which touches you on a personal level. Maybe it's something which you're dealing with within the family or something of the sort. What's unique about tonight's class is that tonight we will be discussing a topic which I think has nothing necessarily to do with death and bereavement. In fact, thank God, death and bereavement is not something which is particularly focal in my life at this point in time. And I found the content of tonight's class to be uniquely profound as it really discusses our mission here on earth. It discusses the role of our soul, where it goes, what it does, etc., etc. And I feel like tonight, as a general rule, is us getting to know our soul a little bit better and finding out what makes us tick and how it makes us tick, etc. With that in mind, tonight we're actually going to open with the lesson video. So please pay close attention.
Birth and death are as contradictory as night and light, but they are strangely associated with an identical Hebrew word, kever. Kever means a tomb where a body is buried. But kever also means a womb where life is formed. A womb is a gateway to life, while a tomb is a gateway to afterlife. But is there an afterlife? Or does laying a body to rest in a grave mark the absolute end? If it were within our power to interview a soul, we would undoubtedly glean insight into afterlife. Instead, we have chosen to eavesdrop on a set of twins in their mother's womb to shed some light on the before life.
Hey, twin, I'm scared of birth. Why? It's the end of existence. We get ejected. We're finished. I'm also anxious, twin, but I'm not scared. Birth is supposed to be a transition to the real life. Huh, don't give me the hiccups with your after-birth real-life fantasies. How can life be supported without an umbilical cord and amniotic fluid? Well, maybe it's a radically different form of life. Maybe we won't need the cord. I wish you were right. I keep kicking that thing away from my neck. Stop spinning for a minute and imagine, twin. After birth, we will enter a ginormous universe filled with light and with air that we will breathe through our mouths. Come on, grow some brain cells, will you? Mouths are not for breathing. Besides, if your postnatal paradise existed, why has no one ever returned from that realm? Forget it. Once we leave here, we collapse into cold, dry nothingness and wither into eternal gloom. I don't think Mother would allow that to happen. She nurtures us in this cozy womb. She sends us nutrients for months on end. For what purpose? Just to end it all with birth? No. Mother has greater plans for us than that. Now you're beginning to sound infantile. Do you see a mother lurking in some corner of the womb? Not a trace. Show me a mother. And as for your nutrients, can't you feel that annoying cord? Don't exchange empirical for fantastical.
Thankfully, these two delightful infants made it safely to the other side. They grew up in the universe that one had described and the other had denied. And until today, they continue their clamorous debate. It is only that the topic of contention has slightly shifted from, is there life after the womb, to, is there life after the tomb?
So the point The point of this beautiful parable, I thought the writing they did with those kids' lines was fantastic. The point of the parable, of the argument between the twins that are in utero, is the reality that there is something beyond our present state of existence. The world that we know right now to be ours, that we dwell in and inhabit, is not the only world that exists. The reality is that the next world to come is something we can barely comprehend or envision, but that does not make it any less true or less valid that it exists. We are so entrenched in the reality of our own ways, we cannot fathom a reality outside of our present reality. But just because we cannot see it or fathom it or even begin to comprehend of what it might be like, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And indeed, as was so poignantly coined in that video, as human beings, we in fact are born twice. One time we transition out of the womb, and one time we transition out of the tomb. And these are two equally beginning stages. These are two equal, absolutely new stages in the context of everything that is going on in our lives. Tonight, we're going to speak about the afterlife. Tonight, we're going to speak about what exactly that process is like when we transition from this world through the tomb into the next world. We've talked a lot about mourning. We've talked a lot about the journey of the soul. And we've talked about the fact that it departs, it maintains a connection with its loved ones, etc., etc. But where it goes and what it does is something that we have not really touched on yet. Let's begin on page 128 with exercise 4.1. What do you know, or you think you know, about the Jewish view on afterlife? What would you like to know about the Jewish view on afterlife? Does anybody want to chime in, either unmuting themselves or chatting at me? What do you currently know about the afterlife, and what is it that you would like to know about the afterlife? I believe if you'd like to unmute, you should have that capacity. There we go. You all have the ability to unmute now. Anybody?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Jill, go ahead.
Okay. So do we have, like, after you pass in the afterlife, do you recognize people who were in your family that passed before you?
That are up there or down here?
Up there.
Good question. I don't know if we'll touch on that tonight. If we haven't, if you don't feel that question has been answered sufficiently, please ask me again at the end of class, okay? Good. Joan and Antonino.
Hi.
What would you like to know about the afterlife? Thank you for calling. Welcome to the JLI show. What can we do for you?
Will we be able to associate with family members in the afterlife?
Good question. Good question. Let's see if we can touch on that as well. Laura points out that since no one has ever returned, we really know nothing about the afterlife. Well, that is true. If all we were relying on were personal reviews, then we would have very, very little to go on. Thankfully, we are clued into some other sources of information beyond the testimonials of some repeat clients. What I personally love, and this is going to lead into the next question, what I love whenever I'm approached by someone who wants to know Judaism's view on afterlife, I find it most interesting that no one ever asks me if Judaism believes in heaven. That's kind of taken for granted. The question that I get all the time is, Rabbi, does Judaism believe in hell? That seems to be less of a given than the idea that Judaism believes in heaven. John wants to know if we have physical bodies. John, we will touch on that tonight. On the topic, as I mentioned earlier, I apologize for the multiple intrusions of jokes. There are so many good jokes surrounding afterlife and the journey to there, and specifically on the topic of heaven and hell. But they tell the story, great story about the man from Chicago who once left Chicago behind. He was going to sunny Florida. It was a great vacation to leave the sunny streets of Chicago, the snowy streets of Chicago, and his wife was planning on joining him the following day after he had gotten down to Florida and gotten himself all situated. When he got to Florida and checked into his hotel room on the beach, he decided to send an email to his wife to let her know what it was like down in Florida. The problem is that his wife had a very, very similar name to someone who had just lost their husband, and he misspelled his wife's name by one character, and instead he sent an email to this grieving widow. And when the widow read the email, she passed out from shock. What did the email say? Dear honey, just got checked in. Everything is prepared for your arrival tomorrow. It sure is hot down here. Laura, I see you laughing, so I know that someone cared for the joke. All right, good. Jill, I got a chuckle out of Jill and a smile out of Marvin. Wonderful. Jay wants to know, what age or stage of life are we in the afterlife? Good question. Let's see if we answer that in tonight's class. In order to gain an understanding of what is the afterlife, what are we aiming for in the afterlife, let's do exercise 4.3 together, which might be a little bit funky in over Zoom, but we're going to attempt it nonetheless. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open the chat box. I'm going to call out these different sources of pleasure, and I'm going to ask you to please rate these 1 through 10, 1 being the least pleasurable and 10 being the most pleasurable. So exercise 4.3 on page 130. Rate the following according to the degree of pleasure they would provide you. If you had a very ample dose of the following, would it bring you a little bit of pleasure or a lot of pleasure? If you had happiness, if you had finally attained the human goal of finding happiness, Jill, the book is not on the screen. We are working out of our textbooks tonight. If you had managed to attain happiness, would that make you very pleasurable or somewhat pleasurable? Feel free to just chat at the number. I got a 10, 110 so far. 10 from Jill, 9 from John. Okay, let's move on. If you had a lifetime membership to an exclusive country club, would that bring you a little bit of happiness or a lot of happiness? A lifetime membership to not to Chabad. Chabad is a very nice place to have a lifetime membership to, but to an exclusive country club. 1 from Myra and Joshua, 5 from Marvin, 2 from Jay. Come on, people, I'd give it a 7. Just being honest. Maybe I never belonged to a country club before. That's why. Esther gives it a 5. I'm closer to Esther and Jill on this one, I think. Okay. Laura, Esther gave it a 1. Laura says 5. I'm with Laura. Okay, fine. Let's continue. If you had love, if you had attained the love, would that make you very happy or somewhat happy? Let's see what you think. Esther, 10. John, 10. Jill, 10. 10s all around. 10 from Marvin. You get a 10 and I get a 10. Jen gets a 10. Jay gets a 10. Wonderful, wonderful. Jay gives a 9. Okay, fine, good. Wealth. If you had an unlimited supply of wealth, how happy would that make you? 12. 7. 12. Joshua Myra with 12 was 12 love or wealth? 7 for Esther, 7 from Marvin, 5 from Laura, 8 from Jen, 2 from Jill, 4 from John. Okay. I see where this is going. 9 from Cheryl. Okay, fair enough. Hawaiian cruise. A Hawaiian cruise, and you know what? Just to sweeten the pot, I would add a Hawaiian cruise with just a lifetime supply of JLI classes just playing on a loop. Hawaiian cruises with JLI classes. Marvin, a 3, a 1. Friends, JLI all day. Laura says 10 cruise in today's day and age. 7 from Jay, 3 from Jen, 2 from Cheryl, 7 from Myra, Joshua, and Kathy. I'm glad to see the JLI. 1 from Esther. Well, Esther, I hope that's more an indication of your take on the cruise and not on the JLI class. Never mind. Fine. A lifetime of meaning. If you could achieve a lifetime of meaning, how happy would that make you? How happy would it make you to have a lifetime of meaning? 10, 10, 10, 8, 12, 100. Jen, I don't know if that's a typo or what. Good. 10 from Jay, 10 from Myra, Joshua, and Kathy, 10 from Cheryl. Wow. Social status. Social status. If you maxed out your friend limit on Facebook and you had 10,000 Instagram followers, would that make you very happy or a little happy or moderately happy? 2 from Jen, 2 from Cheryl, 5 from John, 8 from Jill, 5 from Marvin, 6 from Jay. Okay. And last but not least, wisdom. If you were wise enough to teach a JLI class, how happy would that make you? How much happiness would that bring you? 10s all across the board. Wow. I'm honored. You should only know what it takes to teach a JLI class. Not a whole lot. Fine. Not the point for now. Okay. Feel free to unmute yourself or chat at me the answer to this question. How would you classify the general breakdown of answers as to how people responded to a perception of pleasure. There seems to be a pretty general recurring theme between the two types of pleasure that was seemingly represented in all the different answers that we got tonight. How would you classify that? What was pretty much the dividing line between the higher numbers and, frankly, the lower numbers? Anybody want to give their thoughts?
Well, I think
purposefulness. Purposefulness scored higher.
Yes.
Right.
And I also just wanted to say that wealth scored high, but it depends on what you want to do with your wealth.
So I noticed.
Like, when I think about wealth, and I think if I had all this money, I could make my children's lives easier. I could help friends who needed it. I could do so much more.
Right.
It's
right.
not necessarily that I want to live in a big house. I don't want to clean a big house anyway.
Sure.
But
if you had wealth, you could hire a cleaning lady. But now your point is well taken. But so Cheryl, if I'm understanding you correctly, it seems like we had three different categories of items in exercise 4.3. We had spiritual, or what Jill is referring to as intangible pursuits. Those scored high, right? We talked about happiness, love, wisdom, and meaning. There were material pursuits like the country club and the trip to Hawaii, etc. Those scored low. And then wealth seemed to kind of be this in-between non sequitur that I think we're discussing now kind of was in the middle because it's unclear what we want to do with wealth. Would that be fair?
Very fair.
Okay, everyone agree? Do I have any dissenters? Any objections from the jury? Or from the bench? Okay, good, fine. Let's hold off on that and let's kind of put that little exercise that we did to bed. Joan, did you want to share something?
The intangible sources far outweigh the physical
tangible
material.
One. Yes, I agree. I think Jill was the one who brought up those expressions. We talked about material versus spiritual, or tangible versus intangible. But I think the results are one and the same. They definitely scored high. Okay, good. Excellent. This was very, very, very productive. In order to understand exactly where we're headed in the afterlife and what the afterlife is comprised of, we are going to discuss a very, very central Jewish theme tonight. And that theme, beyond the idea that we are born twice, once from the womb, once from the tomb, that idea is reward and punishment. Is going to be very central to our conversation tonight. The idea that we have reward and punishment, the idea that God takes our actions so seriously that he decides to give out appropriate reward and punishment is a very, very central idea in Jewish thought. Take a look at text 1a on page 132 of your book, where we quote from the Rambam's, from Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. Now, most people are familiar, especially if you've taken a JLI class before, or frankly, any class at Chabad. People are usually familiar with Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, because the idea of believing in Mashiach is one of those 13 principles of faith. However, there are 12 other ones. And today we read principle, I believe it is number 8. Oh, sorry, number 11, staring me in the face. Text 1a, the 11th of the 13 principles of Jewish faith is that God, blessed be he, rewards those who observe the commandments of the Torah and punishes those who transgress its prohibitions. Right? God is an impartial judge, and God believes in reward and punishment. Where does that primary reward and punishment take place? Let's continue into text 1b. The greatest reward is the pleasures of the world to come. By and large, the majority of rewards that we talk about are expressed in the world to come. The strongest punishment is to be cut off from the world to come. The real epitome of punishment and reward takes place in this world. Why is that? Why does the substantial reward and punishment take place in the next world? Well, as we kind of just talked about in exercise 4.3, we all agree that spiritual rewards are far more intense than physical rewards. And so Maimonides says if we really want to apportion reward and punishment in a way that people will appreciate the intensity of the concept, we should hand that out in a system. We should hand that out in an environment where it would really properly and appropriately be appreciated. So Maimonides says that for every one of our actions, there's either reward or punishment, and most of those rewards and punishments take place in the world to come. So let's quickly run through the notion of reward and punishment as we talked about it tonight. As we discussed, reward and punishment comes in both physical and spiritual forms. There are manifestations of reward and punishment that take place in this world, and thus it is expressed in both ways. Spiritual reward and our punishment is primary, and thus spiritual reward is infinitely more enjoyable. There are people who cash out their chips in this world, and the reward that they experience is the physical manifestation of a reward. Asks Laura Green, where does God draw the line? We can't observe all the laws, so does following 100 commandments count 150 and 500? That is a wonderful, wonderful question, Laura. It's one that could be an entire discussion unto itself, but let me suffice by saying this. God is the ultimate judge. God is the ultimate knower of all things. I think that God draws the line at what he knows to be sincere and honest. So you may have someone who fulfills only 100 commandments, but the effort that goes into their observance of the 100 commandments, and based on what they know in this world, what they do with those 100 commandments is far more substantial than someone else who observes 400 commandments and is an entirely different person at heart. So God does not draw an arbitrary line, as God is the knower of all things, and thus arbitrary lines don't really work for him because he really knows what's at heart. Fair enough? Good. Before we discuss the nature of reward and punishment in the afterlife, before we talk about what that reward and punishment looks like, we need to address for a moment the elephant in the room. And that is that the reality of the situation is many people are uncomfortable with the entire concept of reward and punishment, right? We live in a world right now that really frowns on the concept of punishment. We live in the age of participation trophies where everyone's a winner and everyone does well and everyone's trying their best and that's what counts. And so the notion that you may not have behaved in an appropriate way is something which society is a little bit uncomfortable with in today's day and age. By and large, the issue with the concept of reward and punishment is twofold. Number one, there are those of the opinion that the issue of reward and punishment is the meaning to God. God sits there like a traffic cop, like a meter maid, and God is watching everyone who somehow messes up, who somehow does something inappropriate. God has nothing better to do with his life than to watch people who are not observing the Shabbat and who are not putting on tefillin and who are sinning, and God just gets enjoyment out of sitting there and zapping them when they do something wrong. I mean, is God that bored? Is God that infantile that he wants to start picking up on all of the small issues in this world? Furthermore, there are people that will share their opinion that the concept of reward and punishment is actually demeaning to us as humans. God has such little confidence in us as human beings that we cannot do the right thing just for the sake of doing the right thing, that will only do it for the sake of reward and punishment. It's a little insulting to us. So along the lines of the second idea, that the concept of reward and punishment is a little bit demeaning to us, we obviously have an explanation for that. Reward and punishment is not the ultimate way for God to structure his world. I have a friend who sent me a text last week. I texted him, I needed to ask him about something. So he says, hey, I'll call you back in an hour. I'm in the middle of sexual harassment training at my job. I said, oh, okay, cool. Call me back in an hour. So an hour later, he calls me back. And I said to him, I was sexual harassment training. And he says, oh my God, it was horrible. So what do you mean it was horrible? He says, basically in sexual harassment training, they said to us the following: do not sexually harass another employee. Why? Because if you do, the company will be sued. We understand that an ecosystem has a number of layers. Ideally, don't sexually harass someone in your company because it is the absolute worst thing you could do as a human being. Now, some people are not altruistic. Some people lack integrity. Some people lack morals. Some people lack ethics. And so for those sorts of people, you have to approach the issue from a different lens. Don't sexually harass, because if you do, we're going to get sued. So we understand the idea that reward and punishment is somewhat integral for a system that is inhabited by limited and flawed human beings, because that's the only way to really get the message across to us at times is carrot and stick. But the idea of why reward and punishment is not demeaning to God is actually explained in a fascinating piece of Jewish philosophy called the Rekanti. Join me for a moment on page 134, numbered text 2. Do not consider the punishments described in the Torah as comparable to penalties a person incurs for disobeying the decree of a mortal king. Not at all. Rather, they are completely natural consequences. For one who fails to observe a Torah commandment is denied the good that naturally results from its observance. It is comparable to one who fails to sow his field and therefore cannot reap a harvest, or one who fails to wear clothes and is then cold. It is as natural a consequence as the warmth provided by fire, the wetness of water, and the satiation of bread. In the same way, it is the nature of each mitzvah to provide the positive consequences that are promised for its observance, or the negative consequences that are stated regarding its transgression. Says the Rekanti. He explains as follows. As human beings, we are all dependent upon food to survive. None of us can survive without food. How do we get food? How do we go about procuring food? Says the Rekanti, there are two ways to go about it. System number one of getting food works as follows. This is what we call, according to the Rekanti, a reward. How does a reward work? First, we work. Now notice the person who's working in this slide is working at something not related to the food. Let's call him a tailor. The tailor works. The tailor makes a suit. He sells the suit and the tailor gets money. What does the tailor then do with this money? He sells the money and he gets food. Is the money that he got from making the suit directly related to the food? No. The tailor could have taken the money he got for selling the suit and he could have bought, I don't know what with it. He could have bought anything in the world he wanted with it. Is the suit related to the food? No, the tailor could have taken the suit and given it away for free or put it on himself and never bartered an ounce of food for the suit. So the suit is not related to the food and the money is not related to the food. With the money, he made a choice to go and get the food. That is what Jewish philosophy refers to as a reward. That's not what we're talking about over here. What we're talking about is the idea of a consequence. How does a consequence work, says the Rekanti? It works differently. A farmer goes ahead and sows the earth. He plants seeds. Then he reaps the harvest. And once he has finished sowing and reaping with the wheat that he has then created, he is able to make food. That is what we refer to as a consequence. There's a straight line from the sowing process to the food that will end up on the table. To use the other example of the Rekanti, suppose you go to the doctor and the doctor says, "Hey, Bob, it's cold outside. Have you been wearing a coat?" And you say, "No, Bob, no, doctor, I don't believe in coats. I find coats to be way too restricting for my personality." So the doctor says, "Bob, if you don't wear a coat, you're going to catch a cold." "How dare you say that, doctor? That's offensive. You're punishing me for not wearing a coat. You're telling me that if I don't wear a coat, you're going to make me catch a cold?" No, Bob. What I'm saying is, if you go outside without a coat, the natural consequence of what you do is that you will catch a cold. This is not an arbitrary decision. This is what happens. We have a system of punishment in our civilized society, in our democracy, which is similar to aspect A, which is similar to the reward model. If I speed, why do I have to give money to the government? If I am caught speeding on the highway, why must I give $150 to Salt Lake City? What did Aaron Mendenhall do to deserve the money for my speeding? Nothing. It is an unrelated punishment. In the society that we live in, it was decided that to deter speeding, we create tickets, we create fines. However, it's not a straight line from my actions to what happens as a result of my actions. Explains the Rekanti that the idea of reward and punishment as described in the Torah is much more similar to the idea that we see up on the screen before us, the idea of consequence. When we do something good, we create added goodness in the world, and that is what we benefit from. When we violate one of the Torah's precepts, we create a chink in the armor of what God has created in this world. We create an issue in the entire spiritual flow of worlds, and as a result of that, there's a consequence for our actions. This idea is actually expressed many, many generations before the Rekanti. It's expressed in a profound statement in Pirkei Avot and the Ethics of Our Fathers. Join me on page 135, text 3 for a moment. The Ethics of Our Fathers says as follows: Sheschar mitzvah mitzvah, schar aveira aveira. The reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. The retribution for a sin is a sin. On a very basic level, the interpretation of this Mishnah is that when one does a mitzvah, God facilitates for the doer of that mitzvah to do another mitzvah. when one does something wrong, God sadly kind of puts the person down that rabbit hole and sets up situations for that person to do inappropriate things again and again. But in fact, the Jewish mystics explain that there is something more profound included in this Mishnah of the ethics of our fathers. Schar mitzvah, the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. The reward of the mitzvah is the positivity that was created in this world as a result of the mitzvah, which is far more profound than any nice thing we'll obtain in the world to come. Any 5 more minutes we'll get in paradise. And sadly, schar aveda, the retribution for a sin, is a sin. The most horrible thing that we could do as a result of committing a sin is the sin itself. Fundamental to any sort of healthy, civilized society, when somebody commits a sin, more important than the arbitrary punishment that we impose upon them is the understanding that they did something fundamentally wrong. When they can grasp that concept and deal with the after effects of that concept, the guilt that they go through for feeling that is far more profound than any jail time or any sort of arbitrary punishment from the outside we can impose on someone who has broken a law. And that is indeed the idea expressed in this Mishnah and the ethics of our fathers. Let's see this idea continued more in the books of Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism. Text 4 on page 136. The fires of Gehenna, we'll talk about what Gehenna means later, are stoked in direct proportion to the degree to which the wicked fan their fiery passions. Accordingly, we must say that Gan Eden paradise is amplified by the tremendous passion that the righteous invest in their Torah study and in their performance of God's commandments. They take great pleasure and delight in God himself, and their deeds generate a corresponding abundance of light in Gan Eden. So central to the idea of reward and punishment as it exists in Jewish thought is a very, very important paradigm shift. God does not stand there with a cattle prod and with a bucket of lollipops, choosing to give out arbitrary punishments or rewards to people who he sees fit for deserving either the poke or the sweet. What we do, the consequences of our actions are so profound that what we do sets into motion huge, huge reactions. And what we do as human beings is we live the outcomes of those reactions. Let's see this idea expressed in tonight's meditation. I'm sorry, let me conclude with this slide. The afterlife ultimately is a world we create with our actions.
Today's reflection meditation is going to help us begin to appreciate the massive influence that we have by performing one small deed here in this physical world while our souls are in bodies. There's somewhat of a paradox. On one hand, you see, we know that the physical world is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just one layer or level of reality, and that there is so much more to reality behind, in back of this veneer that we see, the physical world that we see. There are spiritual worlds behind spiritual worlds, behind spiritual worlds. And yet, at the same time, we know that what we do in this lowest world, in the physical world, has repercussions in the highest heavens. How do we wrap our minds around that paradox? That on one hand, we're in the lowest world, and on the other hand, we are affecting what goes on in spiritual realms. So the reflection that will help us with this is the visualization of a metaphor. Very simple metaphor. Imagine, if you will, a lever. What's a lever? A lever is basically two things. It's a stick and a wedge. You put the stick on the wedge, called the fulcrum, and you can lift things much bigger than you could without the lever. Now imagine you're lifting a big boulder, let's say. If you have a long enough lever, It's possible. Now, when you are moving the long side of the stick, think about the fact that when you're moving that end just a little bit, it's causing massive fluctuations on the other end. That's like our world. On one hand, we're very far away from the fulcrum, but it's precisely because we're far away that little movements on this end cause massive movements on the other end. Try to imagine yourself doing a mitzvah, a physical act. Something small in that it lasts for a moment. It takes place in one specific location. In that sense, it's small. And now imagine how that small movement is really moving the long side of the stick, the long side of the lever. Imagine how your small movement here in this world is causing massive movements in the heavens. We'll take a moment to visualize and to try to feel the leverage, the power that our small actions have.
Okay, are there any questions on this part of the class before we transition? Because this really does kind of conclude one section, and the part we're going to talk about now is of a completely different nature.
I do have a question.
Go ahead, Char.
Sometimes when you want to do something like a mitzvah, you wind up doing something not good on the other end. Let me give you an example. Let's say somebody you know needs some money and you want to give them that money. But your husband says to you, we don't have enough for our own budget. Do not take the money and give them the money. But you really feel for your friend. You really feel like you could play around with the budget a little. And so you sneak behind your husband's back and you go give the money to the friend. So now you've done two things. You've betrayed your husband's trust, which is a bad thing, but you gave money to your friend, which is a good thing. So what is that? How do you reconcile that?
I'd say that your act probably has two side effects corresponding to the two things you've done. The measure of goodness you brought into this world by giving your friend the money creates some added goodness in the world, and the little bit of deception that was necessary in order to make it happen creates some negativity in the world. But like both can be true. The world is not arbitrarily always good or always evil. There are times that it's there's influence of good. There's a time there's an influence of negativity, and at times we can make both things happen in one shot.
Okay.
It's a complicated situation, and a complicated situation will usually have complicated side effects. I guess that's the best that I could tell you. Like you say, you're doing something right and something wrong all at once, and as a result of that, the side effect that your actions have are a little bit right and a little bit wrong.
Okay.
I'm afraid that's the best I got.
Okay. I'm afraid those kinds of things happen more often than we want.
I would agree with you. I would absolutely agree with you. And this is something we talked a lot about in our last JLI course about, the constant mess of good and evil that exists in this world, and nothing really can seem to be totally right or wrong as a result of that. And that is a sad reality of the world we live in. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Now we're going to get to the I guess the important conversation, the one that everyone's been looking forward to. By way of introduction, There were 3 healthcare professionals that were at a healthcare conference, and they were taking an Uber to the convention center in the morning, and the Uber got into a horrible car accident, and they died. And these 3 healthcare professionals came before the pearly gates to be judged, and the first of the car walks forward and he says, I was a doctor. I treated people. I saved lives. I did tremendous things. I would like to be rewarded commensurate with my actions. And the angel says, you, doctor, can go straight to heaven. The next guy gets up and he says, I was a psychiatrist. I treated people at their worst. I helped people regain balance and some semblance of normalcy in their lives. And I would like to be rewarded commensurate with my actions. And the angel says, you, doctor, can go straight to heaven. And the third guy walks up and he says, I worked for an insurance company. I helped people get effective healthcare at a good cost, and I tried to benefit as many people as I could. And I, too, would like to be rewarded commensurate with my actions. And the angel says, you, sir, can go straight to heaven, but only for 3 days. That's as much as your coverage covers. After that, you can go to hell. Hell, scary word. What does Judaism say about hell? Let me put it to you this way. Judaism believes in the concept of hell, but not hell. What do I mean by that? Judaism believes in a concept which is referred to in Jewish thought as Gehenna. Why it's called Gehenna and where the word comes from is really not the conversation for it. But Judaism believes in a concept called Gehenna, and Gehenna is not eternal damnation. Let's start by talking about what Gehenna is not. Gehenna is not the fiery furnace where sinners go to burn forever. Gehenna is not eternal damnation. What is Gehenna? Gehenna is a divine rehab facility. Gehenna is the place where souls go for spiritual rehabilitation. Now, before we talk about what that spiritual rehabilitation looks like, let's start with a far more fundamental question. Why does our divine soul need rehab? Our divine soul, which is a slice of godliness and maintains its spirituality and its perfection the entire time that it stays in this world, why must it go to a rehab facility? One of the beautiful explanations that's given is the reality of the situation is, as pristine and as profound as our divine soul is, the reality of the situation is that each one of our physical actions in this world has an effect on more than one person. Let's take, for example, the good deed of charity, what's considered to be the central good deed of all the good deeds in the Torah. If I give charity to somebody else, if I give money to somebody else who's in need, who is affected by my actions? Of course, the poor man is affected by my actions. Him and most likely his wider family. They now have ample money to put food on the table and buy clothes for their kids and do whatever it is they wanted to do with the money. The truth of the situation is, though, as much as they are affected, I too am affected. I, the giver, am affected. Because each time I give, I become kinder. And with every dollar that I give to charity, I become more and more transformed into more and more of a giving person. It's the nature of good things that we do that they leave lasting effects on us and they transform us into more giving people. Sadly, the opposite occurs as well. The more and more negative things we do, the more and more negative we become. The more and more that leaves a very profound mark on us, and we, become really kind of affected by the negativity of our actions. When a soul finishes a stint in this world, the reality is a lot of what what has happened in this world rubs off on the soul. And in order for the soul to cleanse off whatever has rubbed off on it, it goes to spiritual rehab. Before the soul can enter paradise and really benefit and derive pleasure from God's presence as it is in the world to come, as it is in paradise, it needs to go to a rehab facility. The example I always like to give in this sort of conversation when people ask me about hell in Judaism is everyone has a nice set of dishes in their cabinet, a nice china set. What is the point of using a china set? What is the point of your fine china? That when you have very, very honorable visitors come over, when you want to make a nice dinner, you serve it on your fancy china. The point of having fancy china is to actually make your fancy china dirty. What do you do when you finish eating on your fancy china? You don't pick up your china, which is now dirty, and say, it has been sullied. To hell with you, and you break it into a million pieces. No. You put it in the dishwasher. In the dishwasher, all these substances that have rubbed off on your china are cleansed. Dishwashers are china rehabs. They are rehab facilities for your fancy china. That is exactly what the soul needs to go through after it's been put in this world. And in its time in this world, a lot of stuff got stuck to it, which is the point, which is what's meant to happen. The reality is that on its way up, it needs to go through a cleansing process. There's actually a fascinating story told in the Talmud about a figure called Acher. We'll talk about it in a moment. And the reason we bring up the story is really to focus on the last line to show you how the Talmud views the concept of Gehenna. Acher was a great Torah sage. Acher was actually a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, and his name originally was Elisha ben Avuya. At some point in his life, he went through, I guess, what we would call a midlife crisis, and he went from becoming a great Torah sage to a complete degenerate and a horrible, horrible human being who made some really, really poor choices in his own life, in addition to selling out his brothers, the Jewish people, and slandering them to the Roman government. So much so that he's referred to in the Talmud as Acher, as other. He's called other. So much so we don't want to bring ourselves to say his name. The Talmud tells us a fascinating story about what happened when Acher died. Text number 5, page 130. Elisha ben Avuya was a former Mishnaic sage who turned to such public heresy and treachery that he was derogatively named Acher, something else. When Acher died, the heavenly court declared, "We will not afflict him with judgment in Gehenna, nor will we permit him to enter paradise." Their reasoning: we will not afflict him with judgment because he studied too much Torah, but we will not permit him to enter the paradise because he sinned egregiously. Acher's former disciple, Reb Meir, said, "Better that he indeed be judged and punished so that he may then enter paradise." Interestingly enough, there are some people in this world that have to go to rehab, and the rehab they have to go to is court mandated. It's court-ordered rehab. You know what is the hardest place for people like that to be in? It's not the court-ordered rehab. It's the limbo that they find themselves in before they're admitted to a rehab facility. Ask anyone who's ever had to go for treatment what the worst part of the treatment process is, and it's waiting, that endless waiting period before we actually begin to get the help we need from that treatment. And indeed, Acher found himself perpetually in this limbo, or at least they wanted to put him perpetually in this limbo, that he was going to be in no man's land. Couldn't go up, couldn't go down, stuck somewhere in the middle. And the point the Talmud makes is that Reb Meir prayed for him that he should go to Gehenna. Reb Meir prayed for him that he should effectively go to Jewish hell. And the idea that we're bringing out is, this is not hell, this is rehab, this is what the soul needs to do on its way up. Let's talk a little bit about how that works, what exactly happens in Gehenna. Take a look at text 6, page 139 from Jewish Mysticism. The purpose of Gehenna is to refine the soul and rid it of any sickness that it contracted. This is similar to the process of smelting silver, wherein the dross and sediment is burned away in a furnace, leaving the silver clean and free of impurities. Similarly, for the soul to be able to experience the light of the supernal pleasures and bask in God's radiance, it must first be refined in the spiritual fire of Gehenna, whereby the negative is purged from the positive. And so to give it right now we're referring to it as a rehab facility. Let's refer to it with a more emotional term that we're going to use to really kind of give it context in tonight's class. What Gehenna really is spiritual catharsis, soul catharsis. And what exactly we mean by that? Let's take a look at a more contemporary Torah text. Take a look at text 7 on page 139. Then refers to when someone ends up in Gehenna. Then an individual will also see himself in a new light. Even in our mortal physical state, looking at oneself can sometimes be pleasing, and at other times very painful. Imagine standing naked before God with your memory wide open, completely transparent without any jamming mechanism or reducing valve to diminish its force. You will remember everything you ever did. You will see it in the light of the unshaded spirit, or if you will, in God's own light that shines from one end of creation to the other. The memory of every good deed and mitzvah will be the sublimest of pleasures, but your memory will also be open to all the things of which you are ashamed. They cannot be rationalized away or dismissed. You will be facing yourself fully aware of the consequences of all your deeds. We all know the terrible shame and humiliation experienced when one is caught in the act of doing something wrong. Imagine being caught by one's own memory with no place to escape. A number of our great teachers write that the fire of Gehenna is actually the burning shame one experiences because of one's sins. Of course, these concepts as used by our sages may also contain deeper mysteries and meanings, but a major ingredient of this fire may be shame. How else could one characterize the agony of unconcealed shame upon a soul? We are taught that the judgment of the wicked lasts 12 months. The pain eventually subsides. The reality of the situation is there are many people that for one reason or another are incapable of experiencing intimate relationships. Might be because of trauma they have in their past, might be because of their own life choices, but for better or for worse, they are unable to experience intimate relationships. What needs to happen in order for them to change that? What needs to happen in order for them to feel, to experience intimate relationships? They need to take a good, hard look at themselves. And they need to take a good, hard look at themselves in a way that doesn't allow them to use rationalizations and excuses that they would ordinarily avail themselves of. They need to really take a look at themselves and allow themselves to strip away all the unhealthiness that has developed over time and allow themselves to find a healthier, cleaner version of themselves that would be open to such an experience. So what happens in the soul catharsis where our soul goes into rehab and our soul effectively sees a soul therapist? The soul experiences the negative effects of its actions. The soul sees what it really did in this world. This painful process of really realizing the depths of what happened cleanses the soul. Once that has happened, once that cleansing process has taken place, once that healing process has taken place, the soul is now able to experience paradise in an unencumbered fashion. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Gehenna. That is soul catharsis or soul rehab. Now, one of the things that is extremely important in this conversation, as we just read in the end of text 7, and we'll see now expressed very clearly from the Mishnah in text 8, on page 141, one of the main fundamental differences beyond this emotional explanation, the difference between Gehenna and hell, is that the maximum sentence of the wicked in Gehenna is 12 months. The longest a person can go through rehab, the longest the rehab facility will take you for is 12 months, not a day less. Even the most wicked among us goes to Gehenna for a grand total of 12 months. And furthermore, the sentence of time in Gehenna can actually be shortened by sincere teshuvah, by real remorse and return to God. We are able on our own to cleanse our most serious offenses. So yes, that is the fundamental difference between Gehenna and hell. It's not eternal damnation. It's not a long-term sentence of fire. It is ultimately just 12 months of rehab. What happens once every soul has undergone those 12 months of rehab tells us the fundamental Mishnah in the Tractate of Sanhedrin. Each member of the Jewish people has a portion in the world to come. As it is stated in Isaiah, your people are all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. They are the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, in which I take pride, regardless of the level of one's piety or morality or religious observance. We all ultimately will inherit the world to come. Any questions on the Gehenna section of class? What about non-Jews? Excellent question, Jay. Non-Jews also do have a sense of heaven, also have a sense of the world to come. This is a Mishnah referring to the Jewish experience in the world to come. And in our faith, the Jewish experience in the world to come is different than the non-Jewish one, but absolutely non-Jews who behave in this world in a righteous and moral, upstanding way also will benefit from paradise in the world to come without question. Anybody else? Feel free to unmute yourself or chat at me. Anybody have any questions about spiritual rehab?
I have a question. I don't know if it's a very dumb question.
No such thing.
We're talking about these ideas, but are they also actual physical places?
No, they are not. There's no physical hell. These are all spiritual experiences. And in a certain sense, I believe we quoted as much in one of our classes a few weeks ago. We used the expression that Gan Eden, that the world to come is right here. Our souls don't go somewhere, galaxies and light years away. Our souls go to a spiritual place. And I would say that both experiences, both rehab and paradise, exist right here.
Okay, so then if that's what it is, and it's spiritual only, then we're doing it only with ourselves, and there's nobody else around then.
Right. So over here is kind of, again, fundamental, the parable for the beginning of class of, the two babies in utero arguing about what life would be like outside the mother's womb. Any sort of experience that we relate to as human beings, one of the definitions of our experience is time and place. We could be in one place, limited, sitting in one chair, in one room, and not anywhere else. And it's difficult for us to use those references when discussing a spiritual topic. So a lot of people talk about this idea of souls basking in the afterlife together, usually in paradise. Souls have that ability to do so in a spiritual sense, even if they're not in the same city, even if they're not in the same place. For us, that's difficult to understand because our parameters of understanding space and place are very, very limited. And in general, any conversation that we have about the afterlife, whether in the positive or the negative, it's difficult for us to use our physical and corporeal terminology for that because that's obviously not the rules that world is bound by.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Thank you.
Good.
Yes.
Good. Cheryl, to that end, when we move on to the paradise section, there's a great story in there that I want to kind of share with you, but we'll get there in a moment. Anybody else? There's a question over here. Hang on a second. I'm sorry, the chat is a little slow tonight. Is it a literal 12 months? Does time exist in the afterlife? Great question. Myra, Joshua, or Kathy, whoever asked that, clearly, as we just talked about, where there's no calendars in Gehenna, but whatever it means, 12 months, I know they have a beautiful calendar up here on the slide. That is actually a very, very good question, one that I will report back to you. I have a feeling it doesn't mean 365 days, from January 1st to December 31st, but there is some sort of concept of time, and yes, that was how long that stay would be. I don't know if it is exactly 12 months on our calendar. Anybody else? Good. Let's move on to paradise. We talked a little bit about Gehenna. We ended off by saying that everyone ultimately ends up in paradise. Let's talk about paradise. There's a beautiful, beautiful analogy given in Jewish thought to give us context about discussing paradise. And the analogy is given, the story is told about the beggar that won the lottery in his town. He won a sum of money that he had never even dreamt of. And as is customary, when you win the lottery, everyone gathers around to ask you, what are you going to do with the money? So they said to the beggar, what are you going to do with this huge sum of money that you have suddenly come into possession of? And he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run for mayor. That's what I want to do with all this money. I want to run for public office. I want to run for mayor of this town, and I'm going to win the election. When you have enough money, you can be sure you'll win the election. I'm going to win the election. And when I win the election on my first day of office, I'm going to pass a law. No house in the city is allowed to be taller than one story. Every house in the city needs to be one floor, one story, just ground level, and that is all. They have to have their front doors on the ground level, and there cannot be an upstairs. So they said to the beggar, why in God's name would you do that? That's what you want to do with the money? How does that help? And the beggar says, because I got to tell you something. Begging, going door to door, trudging from door to door, and having to go up all those steps is really getting weary for me. So after I've won the lottery, what I want to implement is a new set of rules that will make schnorring easier for me after I've won the lottery. What is the point of the story, friends? The point of the story is that sometimes we are so stuck in our own perspective. We are so stuck in our set of circumstances, we can't begin to imagine what hypothetically it might look like outside of our frame of reference. Let's see this idea expressed in text 10 from the Abarbanel, one of the great Jewish philosophers. Spiritual reward is abstruse and difficult for mortal intellect to visualize and grasp as long as the intellect remains attached to a corporeal body. Just as one who is blind cannot grasp the concept of colors, so the spirit that is engaged with corporeality cannot grasp purely spiritual matters. Imagine, God forbid, that you were having a conversation with someone who is completely blind. And you were trying to explain to them the idea of colors, that when you look at the existence, you see shades and hues and bright colors and darker colors and shinier colors. You see a colorful experience. Try to explain that to somebody who has never seen before in life. He might be able to hear you, and he might be able to understand that you are saying to him that in your world, in your frame of reference, there are different things look different. But how that works is something he will never, ever understand. Explain our mystics, when we talk about paradise, we could have all these great fancy conversations about paradise until we're blue in the face. Ultimately, for us to grasp the idea of what spiritual pleasure is while we are enclosed in the physical body is the definition of an exercise in futility. What do we know about paradise? Well, here's an interesting piece of Talmud that we know about paradise. Take a look at text 11. In the hereafter, there is no eating, drinking, procreation, commerce, jealousy, hatred, or competition. Rather, the righteous, and at this point when it says righteous, it means all of us, as we've all gone through rehab. Rather, the righteous sit, their heads adorned with crowns, and they delight in the radiance of the divine presence. What is paradise? It's not food, it's not drink, like the story we told last week about the couple who died and went to heaven. There's no procreation, and there's no money, and there's no competition. What is paradise? Paradise is the ultimate form of spiritual intimacy. Earlier, I asked you how much you would be pleasured by the ultimate expression of love. And most of you scored love very, very high. As humans, we crave deep, passionate, personal, intimate connections. In this world, whenever we do something right, we forge an intimate bond with God. However, as a result of who we are and what we are in this world, we are not able to realize and actualize that intimate bond to the fullest of its potential. When do we do that? In the afterlife. Paradise is the experience of the depth of this relationship. Paradise gives us the ability to tap into that intimate bond with God in its most profound sense. I want to just digress over here for a second and hop back to the point. I know there was a lot of discussion when we started class tonight about being with people in the afterlife. So yes, in this sense, Judaism definitely believes that we are reunited with our loved ones in the afterlife. Our souls are able to connect and also enjoy the bonds of intimacy that were created through our relationships in this lifetime. It's important, though, to realize that we're not seeing each other and hugging and kissing and interacting as we did in this world, because again, the frame of reference of the afterlife is like nothing we can begin to fathom in this world. So are we reunited with our loved ones? Absolutely. Without question. There's text that says as much, but that reunion looks very, very different than it does in this world. I think we've gotten so affected by culture and what how society shows us heaven and hell. We so often see these depictions of heaven, of the people with the wings, and we see every person we've ever loved in this world with wings on, and we see them embracing, and this one dies and it goes up, and there's the whole welcoming committee. It's great. It's great for cartoons and it's a great visualization, but it's important to realize that that is nothing like the reality. And so, yes, we're able to connect with our loved ones and to I guess, reconnect bonds and connections that we had whilst in this world, but obviously not in the same fashion. What's interesting to note as we wrap up the section on paradise, recently, there was a study done. When I say recently, I believe it was about 8 years ago. There was a study done about the effects of spiritual and religious beliefs on bereavement. There was a study done, putting together, I believe, over 50,000 different people who had participated in studies about death and bereavement, and talking with them if having some sort of connection to some sort of faith group or religious beliefs or spiritual ideations somehow helped them through their process. In fact, 94%, you could see via breakdown on page 144 in your textbook, but 94% shared some positive effects as a result of having religious beliefs. And they shared with whoever was conducting the study that religion was a great source of strength for them. In fact, believing in the afterlife, knowing that our loved ones have gone to a place where they can ultimately be at peace and enjoy all of the fruits of whatever they did in this world, belief in the afterlife greatly helped them with the grieving process. An interesting tidbit of information. Are there any questions before we move on to the final segment of the class? No? Okay. Although we have talked at great length about the fact that our frame of reference for what pleasure looks like in the afterlife is not something that we can compare to from our frame of reference of what pleasure looks like in this life. The reality is that in a certain sense, there are some comparisons. Just like in this world, no two individuals experience the physical world in the same way, so too in the world to come, in paradise, each soul has its personal place and experience. Each soul goes through a process of the afterlife on their own. And in fact, as we're going to talk about now in the end of tonight's class, in paradise, the soul is in a constant state of progressive elevations. Obviously, the entry point, the starting point for how the soul enters the afterlife is obviously commensurate, and it's shaped by the soul's actions in this world. And it begins to experience these divine revelations based on what it went through in this world. But the reality is that as the soul spends more and more time in the world to come, it begins to experience more and more spiritually intense revelations. And there are different things that happen to the soul along its journey that assist it in this continuous climb upward. Although we speak about progressive elevations, the reality is there are a few moments in time where the soul undergoes a quantum leap and skips a whole bunch of steps in the process. By and large, those quantum leaps take place on one's yahrzeit, on the day of one's passing, on the anniversary of one's passing. As we talked about in lesson 2, the moment when a person dies is a moment of tremendous spiritual intensity. At that moment where the soul leaves the body, all the good things the person has done in this world shine in an incredibly intense fashion. And that very, very powerful revelation is re-experienced every year on the day when we relive their passing. So that very spiritual and intense revelation continues and happens again and again every year on their yahrzeit. In addition to that, that's something which happens automatically. It's something which happens as a result of the soul having lived in this world and re-experiencing that powerful blast that happened when the soul departed this world. In addition, there are things that can happen on a regular basis. As we discussed, one of the very important things that sets apart the world to come from this world is the fact that whilst the soul is in this world, it has things to do. It has ways of upping its balance in the ledger. It could do more and more positive things. Once the soul goes to the world to come, what's done is done. Its account is closed, and it's going to benefit however much it benefits. One of the examples given of the soul in the world to come is like a plane on autopilot. It can't be shifted from its course. It's going from here to there, and it's on that route. However, there are some things that can be done to override that autopilot. What are things that can be done to override that autopilot? Let's read text 12 on page 146 together. When individuals act righteously and are outstanding in the service of their Creator, they generate tremendous merit for the souls of their parents. This merit is simply by virtue of their parents having served as the instruments of their births. It is the parents who enabled their soul to be born into this world, which in turn enabled the many righteous deeds that they perform. The parents therefore have a share in their meritorious acts. However, anyone's charity or prayers on behalf of a departed person are beneficial for the soul of the deceased. It is therefore a Jewish custom to give charity and do other good deeds on behalf of the deceased in order to cause satisfaction to the soul. Explains the Rashba, one of the great Jewish thinkers. In addition to the quantum leap the soul experiences on the yahrzeit, there are two ways of overriding the autopilot. One is through our progeny. One is through our descendants. Whenever any one of our descendants do anything good in this world that causes elevation for the soul on high, whether they intended to do it for the sake of the soul or not, any positive thing done by our children in this world, by virtue of the fact that they are our children, and we brought them into this world and we facilitated their becoming the good people that do these good things, those actions elevate the soul. Furthermore, others can also benefit the soul. Any person that does any sort of good deed for the benefit of a loved one who has since departed has the ability to elevate the soul, with an important disclaimer: it requires meditated action. The good deed needs to be done specifically for the purpose of elevating somebody else's soul. Not so with our children. Anytime they do something good, it is of automatic benefit to the soul of the departed, and it automatically causes that elevation. Beyond the good things that are done in general that are of benefit to the soul, of extremely auspicious time for the soul to receive elevation as a result of our good deeds is the first 12 months after the passing. As we've discussed tonight and in other lessons, those first 12 months after the passing is when the soul is making the bulk of its journey up on high. And as we discussed tonight, if the soul needs to spend any time in rehab, it is during those first 12 months. And so, as we can well understand, if there were ever a time that we wanted to add merit in the ledger of the soul's account, the first 12 months, the first year of mourning would be an extremely auspicious time. As we discussed earlier, another auspicious time to do good for the sake of the soul is on the yahrzeit. And interestingly enough, there are 5 days throughout the year that are allocated as times for us to do special things for the benefit of our loved ones, which are the days of Yizkor, the special holidays when we recall the souls of our loved ones on Yom Kippur, the last day of Sukkot, the last day of Pesach, and the second day of Shavuot. Whenever Yizkor is recited, it is an extremely auspicious time for good deeds to be done for the benefit of the soul. If you take a look for a sec on page 147 at figures 4.2 and 4.3, we talk a little bit about some of the suggested mitzvot, some of the good things that are suggested to get involved in for the benefit of the soul. Donate to charity, especially in the first year after the passing. Donate daily, even if only a small amount. Particularly opportune times to give charity are before praying and before lighting Shabbat candles. Attend Yizkor services and pledge to give charity in memory of the deceased. Study Torah. Provide financial support to Torah students and scholars or institutions of Torah study and education. Sponsor a Torah class. Sponsor or donate books on Torah and Jewish practices to a synagogue or library, or write or donate a Torah scroll in the deceased's honor. More particularly, as it pertains to a yahrzeit, one of the days of the quantum leap, figure 4.3, some of the customs that we do as it pertains to a yahrzeit: we light a 24-hour yahrzeit candle to burn the entire time. We recite the Kaddish during all the day's prayers, and if possible, lead the congregational prayers. We visit the grave and recite chapters of Psalms. We donate to charity. We study Torah, especially Mishnah, as it's connected to the name of our loved one. We receive an aliyah. We get called to the Torah on the Shabbat before the yahrzeit. We sponsor a kiddush for the congregation. The blessings recited there serve as a merit for the soul, and we convene a gathering of relatives and friends to commemorate the deceased and discuss and learn from the deceased good deeds. Before we move into I know I said final section about 10 minutes ago. Before we move into the very final section of tonight's class, are there any questions or comments? As we talked about the soul's quantum leap. Very well behaved class tonight, all. All right.
I have a question.
Yes, who's that? Laura, go ahead.
That's Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Since Orthodox is more stringent about a woman being called before Torah, how can a woman observe all these things in memory of a loved one and try to do these good things? Like, I can't get called to the Torah for an aliyah in the Chabad.
Sure. So the reality is that there are a lot of Jews that live in situations where they can't make those things happen. So many Jews live in communities where they can't get called to the Torah before Shabbat because there is no minyan on Shabbat, and they can't recite Kaddish on the day of the yahrzeit because they don't live in a community with a minyan. And so in many, many, many instances where this is not possible, delegating someone to fulfill the obligation on your behalf is something which is very, very well advised and very well practiced, to have someone do these things on your behalf in merit of the loved one. Esther would like to respond to, Laura. Esther, go ahead, please. This is a free-flowing forum.
Oh, hi, Laura. So actually that situation came up for me too, because my father died from COVID, and he had 4 daughters. And my father's an Orthodox rabbi, and his kids are Orthodox or not affiliated. And so what I did was I donated money to Chabad, And because your parents, Rabbi Avrami, sent out an email about that they're giving out Mishloach Manot. So I donated money and I asked them to make the food baskets that they give out in honor of my father. So they put a sticker on it. And so that's one thing. And then also you can like try to get a male relative to say Kaddish or pay someone to say Kaddish. And then it's funny because a Reform woman asked me if she could say Kaddish for my father. And, you know, the expression, he would be rolling over in his grave. If I said yes, and I didn't know how to respond to her because he would not want her to say Kaddish. And then I don't know if you can comment on this, but according to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the only one person is supposed to say Kaddish, and like the Chazan, and then everyone is supposed to follow along. But because it's an emotional thing, they just allow mourners to say Kaddish. But really, I don't know if does that sound?
I'm not sure that, I mean, in a minyan where there are multiple mourners, ideally a mourner should lead the services to say all the Kaddishes that are in the service. But if there is a minyan with multiple mourners, all of them should absolutely say the Kaddish. It's not just an emotional thing. It's a matter of Jewish law. Absolutely one of them should say the Kaddish.
Okay, cool. Say the Kaddish. But you can be creative is my short answer, yes. Laura.
And Laura, I want to share a story with you in a minute, but Jay makes an interesting point. It seems those without children are disadvantaged. Jay, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Yes, you know, when it comes to perpetuating the memory of our loved ones, those without children are severely disadvantaged. I don't think that's a Jewish thing per se. I think that anybody who passes away without progeny, without someone to carry on their legacy, is disadvantaged. You know, that doesn't have to just pertain to Kaddish. Anyone who dies without children is at a certain disadvantage of their legacy not having that ability to be perpetuated. I think that's a pretty fair observation of what the world is like. Although there's a beautiful story in here printed about a gentleman who lived in Israel who lost his father, and he was living in Afula. He was living in a little village in northern Israel in the 60s, which was very, very not developed, and there was no minyan over there. And he was a teacher in a school for children, and he wanted to go and say the Kaddish every single morning, drive down about an hour and a half to some city that did have a minyan. And if he would do that, he would miss about 2 hours of his teaching because it was an hour and a half drive each way. And so he wrote a letter to the Rebbe asking if the Rebbe condoned such behavior to basically take some time off of his teaching responsibilities to drive down for a minyan to say the Kaddish. And the Rebbe told him that the merit of the Torah that you are studying with those children in school far outstrips any Kaddish. And so it would be more preferable for you to keep your day job and say the Kaddish and try to get and teach your children, teach those children and try to find a minyan where possible than to take a huge chunk out of your teaching responsibilities just for the sake of saying Kaddish. By raise of hand, I can see a large portion of you here on the screen. How many of you over here have said Kaddish? How many of you have recited the Kaddish? Okay. How many of you know what the Kaddish actually says? This is, for me, is a tremendous exercise. Whenever someone comes to shul, whenever someone attends a service, or even at a funeral, when someone's saying Kaddish for the first time, we're all familiar with the Kaddish, right? Mandy Patinkin has said Kaddish in multiple TV shows. You know, Kaddish is a very Jewish observance. We're all familiar with the Kaddish, and I think every good Jew can spit out the first 4 words of Kaddish, right? Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei, Rabbah. You know, we all know the first 4 words of Kaddish. There's a moment that every Jew goes through where they look at the English translation for Kaddish for the first time, and they have a huge culture shock. People think that Kaddish is a mourner's prayer. If you asked any Jew, just off the cuff, to translate the Kaddish, write down in English what you think Kaddish says. They probably think Kaddish says, you know, I miss my loved one. I hope they're doing well up there. You know, I'm sad for them. I grieve after them. Take a look for a second, text 13, the English text of the Kaddish. Exalted and hallowed be his great name throughout the world which he has created according to his will. May he establish his kingship, bring forth his redemption, and hasten the coming of his Mashiach. In your lifetime and in your days and in the lifetime of the entire house of Israel, speedily and soon, and say Amen. May his great name be blessed forever to all eternity, blessed and praised, glorified, exalted and extolled, honored, adored, and lauded be the name of the Holy One, blessed be he. Beyond all the blessings, hymns, praise, and consolations that are uttered in the word and in the world, and say Amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and a good life for us and for all Israel, and say Amen. He who makes peace in his heavens, may he make peace for us and for all Israel, and say Amen. Why do mourners say this? Why do we say this after losing a loved one? There's not an ounce of grief in there. There's not an ounce, there's the word consolation, not used in the context of losing a loved one. Why is this the mourner's Kaddish? Why is this the prayer for mourners? What does this have to do with mourning, for God's sakes? Let's take a look at text 14. It's actually very appropriate that we read this in terms of Kaddish. This is a text from Rabbi Yadin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz, for whom Kaddish is being recited now, who passed away from COVID just a short few months ago, and he explains what exactly is Kaddish and why mourners say Kaddish. Every member of the community of Israel is in a sense among those who establish and proclaim God's sovereignty in this world. As the verse states, "You, Israel, are my witnesses," God declares. Therefore, the absence of any individual creates a void, as it were, in God's sovereignty in the world. In order to fill this void, others need to intensify their work and to proclaim on their own behalf, as well as on behalf of the deceased, exalted and hallowed be his great name. With this perspective, you can understand why reciting the Kaddish elevates the soul of the deceased. The aggregate of a person's actions and accomplishments in this world define his or her life. However, the tally of a person's achievements does not necessarily conclude at the moment of death. A complete evaluation of a person's accomplishments must also include all that is accomplished as a result of the person's inspirations and actions. Therefore, when those who remain alive, and especially the person's children and descendants, whose very existence is a credit to their forebears, do good deeds, they contribute to the deceased's balance of accomplishments. For although the deceased is no longer active in this world, his or her actions continue to inspire positive deeds and actions. That is why the recitation of Kaddish elevates the soul, because God is being exalted in this world as a result of and in the name of the deceased. Interestingly enough, Kaddish has nothing to do with loss and mourning and pain and grief. Kaddish is about praising and exalting the name of God, proclaiming God's sovereignty over this world, and showing how the loved one who has departed did his part, his or her part, to contribute to God's sovereignty, which is why Kaddish is being recited in their merit. And I think by having this understanding of Kaddish, we would understand why any sort of good deed done in memory of the deceased is just as important as Kaddish. Kaddish is ultimately a proclamation of God's greatness and holiness. Its recital lifts the soul, and God's name is exalted in the name of the deceased. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, what did we come through in tonight's class? What's the sum total of it all? The sum total of it all is that our soul wants nothing more and nothing less than to have a passionate, intimate relationship with God Almighty. That is all that happens to it in the afterlife. It spends its days in paradise basking in the glow of the infinite and eternal God. How does it get to paradise? It gets to paradise by undergoing a cleansing rehabilitation process in Gehenna. But ultimately, all the soul wishes for in life is to cling to God. Let us remember that all of the experiences that the soul will go through in the afterlife in paradise, all of these tremendous revelations that we have been discussing at great length tonight, are all dependent on our actions in the here and now. Our mission in this world is to be divine operatives in this world, to allow our soul those opportunities and the most opportunities possible to bask in the glow of the infinite in the world to come. Let's read text 15, and with that, we'll wrap it up for tonight. The primary reward in the hereafter is the soul returning to its source and uniting with God. Certainly, however, it is even greater when the soul connects with God here in this world through the study of Torah and the performance of mitzvot, for that is the purpose of creation. By focusing our attentions appropriately in this world to really realizing the potential and what our soul really wants out of everything, living a life of that in this world will allow our soul to have the smoothest and most enjoyable journey as it transitions into the next one. Are there any questions before we go through tonight's key points?
I have a question.
Yes, Laura.
So going back to lesson number 2,
Yes.
We discussed the prohibitions of cremation.
Yes.
If our soul is a metaphysical thing, it's like when you now put all your stuff from your laptop, I guess, into the cloud.
The cloud, yes.
Why does it matter if there's physically a body as opposed to being environmentally conscious and having cremation done? Because it's not going to affect your, well, I don't believe that it will affect your soul one way or the other.
Excellent question. One of the ideas that we expressed in the last class is that the bodiless soul experience that the soul goes through in the afterlife is only the beginning of the afterlife process. The real afterlife process is the resurrection of the dead, when the soul will want to come down into its body. And so one of the fundamental reasons why Torah strongly is against cremation is because, first of all, that makes it impossible for that particular soul to re-enter its body in the period of the resurrection of the dead, A. And B, as we talked about, beyond the fact that the soul goes on and continues in its spiritual experiences in higher realms, the reality of the situation is that what we do with the body affirms our belief in God's enduring relationship with the body, in God's mission that he gave to us with the body. And so the reason why we're meant to keep the body around is not as much related to the soul as it is a definition of how we viewed the entire relationship between soul, body, and God whilst the soul was in this world and even in the time that follows. So true, the soul goes on regardless. The question is, what does it say about the soul's relationship with God in this world? And does the soul have a body to re-enter during the period of the resurrection of the dead? I don't know if that necessarily answers your question and allays your concerns, but those are the textual reasons given. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Once the soul goes to paradise, does it, do you think, have any kind of connection with people who are still living in this world?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if you remember the meditation, I think it was lesson 2, where we talked about the example of a loved one who's on the upper floor of the house, that we can't see them and they can't see us in a certain sense. They could see us more than we can see them, but they're absolutely cognizant and aware and involved in every facet of our lives. Again, in a way that is difficult to comprehend. Where are they? How do they see us? What eyes do they see with? Those are obviously questions which it's impossible for me to answer, but the soul on a soul level is extremely aware and tapped into and involved with everything that is going on with its loved ones behind in this world.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, great.
All right. Key points.
Lesson 4, where we go. 1, God's rewards and punishments are natural consequences of our actions. 2, when we do mitzvot, we forge an intimate relationship with God. In the afterlife, our souls experience the effects of our actions, our relationship with God. This is the greatest possible pleasure and is also known as paradise, Gan Eden. 3, at times, a soul cannot enter paradise immediately, for its inappropriate actions in this world diminished its capacity to experience spiritual pleasures. Gehinnom, a painful yet cleansing process, is temporary. Every soul ultimately reaches paradise. 4, in Gan Eden, the soul constantly ascends to higher levels. Good deeds performed in a person's memory, including the recital of Kaddish, elevate the soul to higher levels that it cannot attain on its own. 5, what we do here and now is more important than the pleasures or pain of the afterlife. Living in order to receive rewards in the next world, or to avoid heavenly punishment, distracts our focus from where it belongs, increasing goodness and godliness in this world.
With that in mind, after we've all talked about where we go, Next week's class is called Where We Go Again. Next week's class will focus on the very, very interesting ideas of reincarnation. We talked about the soul going on this journey. It does its time in this world. It goes into the next world, and then sayonara. Well, not so fast. Next week, we'll talk about the concept of reincarnation. Is it a Jewish ideal? Is it not a Jewish ideal? How does it work? How does it happen? I think I used to be a professional basketball player, which is why I'm so inclined to athletics, and exactly how all that works. We are going to talk about next Monday, March 1st. Believe it or not, next week is March. It was 48 degrees outside today. Next Monday, March 1st at 7:30 p.m. on Zoom. I very much hope to see you all then and there. Have a wonderful week. Have a very happy Purim. Purim is Thursday night and Friday. And I will see you all, Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's help next week.
Thank you. This was wonderful class.
Thank you, Cheryl.